Driving across country is not something I particularly enjoy. I used to not mind it so much back when I wasn't required to do it every other week. I work in the sales department for the largest office supply company in the Midwest. Basically, my job is to contact various other businesses, offices, firms, and sell them office supplies in bulk. This all used to be done digitally. But after one business requested a personalized meeting for the sale, I was dispatched to conduct the interview, just like how they were done before the digital age. Apparently, my sales pitch and presentation were so enjoyable that word returned to my boss, and they promoted me to sales liaison, a fancy new position that required I conduct these in-person meetings regularly. Although I may come across as annoyed with this position, it's not like they weren't accommodating me. I received a significant pay raise, plus commission. I was also reimbursed for most of my travel expenses. It's just after you've been doing these business trips for so long, the journey itself becomes monotonous. Some of you might ask, why don't you just fly like a normal person? Well, I like things to be a certain way. I like to have as much control of my surroundings as possible. When you fly, you forfeit that control for convenience. If I fly and lose my luggage, or have any issues with the car rental place, then I'm basically out of luck. Or if the job goes poorly and I have to head home before my allotted time, I'd need to reschedule a flight, and that by itself is just a pain. So, unless the location is extremely far away, I just prefer to travel by my own means. Recently, I had a job come up which was in the southern part of Kansas. A bit of a stretch for my average travels, but money was money. Having been through Kansas only once in my life previously, I can't say I was particularly excited to revisit. The drive to the company was fine. Actually, it was one of the smoother trips I had taken in a while. Very little traffic, and clear blue skies for as far as the eye could see. I had arrived at around 4 in the afternoon and conducted the meeting immediately upon arrival. The meeting lasted roughly an hour and a half, though most of that time was spent sitting in a waiting room. After all was said and done, all parties involved seemed to be satisfied with their order. I promptly called my boss to inform him of the new account we had just acquired, and he returned a curt, "good work." My boss wasn't what you'd call a people person, hence why I was the one doing these meetings and not him. However, I could tell he was quite pleased. You work with someone for so long, you pick up on a few things. I tossed my briefcase into my car and hit the road. After driving for nearly 2 hours, the road and horizon were starting to blur together. With a yawn, I looked down at the time. It was nearing 8 p.m. The burnt orange sky was quickly fading into a dark blue. As I sat there fidgeting in my seat, the urge to find a bathroom was beginning to creep up on me. I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of a turnoff for a fast food restaurant or even a gas station. However, no sign was to be seen. It was just mile marker after mile marker, and they were passing by at a rapid pace. There were no turnoffs, at least, not that I could see. I grabbed my phone off my dash and began to pull up my GPS. I needed to find the nearest rest area quickly. However, before I could properly scan my phone, I glanced up to maintain my position on the road, and saw a dull blue sign appear on the right. "Rest stop in 5 miles," it read. I closed out my phone and with a smile placed it back on its stand. Relieved, I relaxed back into my seat and continued driving. As I was quickly approaching mile 5, I couldn't seem to spot the rest stop in the distance. I was becoming increasingly concerned, and after another 10 stressful minutes, a building began to appear on the horizon. Seeing an entranceway, I turned the wheel and pulled in. The rest stop didn't seem like anything special, but by that point I didn't care. I just needed a bathroom. I hopped out of my car, and when I did, I noticed I wasn't alone at this place. There was a truck sitting a few yards away, parked near the door to the building. I briskly walked towards the building, and as I passed by in front of the truck, I felt eyes on me. I turned my head and saw a man sitting in the driver's seat staring straight ahead. It was a man wearing sunglasses, just sitting there with both hands on the steering wheel. He didn't seem to be looking directly at me though, just in my general direction. Aside from his sunglasses, I couldn't get a good look at his face with how dark it was becoming, but I pushed the whole situation out of my mind and continued onward. As I was leaving the bathroom, I noticed a vending machine. I bought a Snickers and stepped outside. When I did, I looked up and saw that the truck was gone. It was in that moment that a feeling of isolation started to creep up in the back of my mind. Now, I knew I had been alone this entire trip, but for some reason that feeling of being by myself became painfully apparent. I looked around for a few moments to see if anyone else was nearby. After shaking the weird thoughts from my mind, I hopped back into my car and returned to the highway. Once I was driving, I started to calm down some. I even put on some music to help me get out of my own head. After driving for another hour, I spotted something on the side of the road. It was a dull blue sign that said "Rest Stop in 5 miles." When I read those words, a chill came over me, and that feeling of isolation returned. I tried my best to banish the feeling from my mind. However, before I could shift my mind onto something else, I saw it. The same exact rest stop. I slowed down a bit and looked at it. It was purely identical to the one I had previously stopped at. I attempted to rationalize that the state had simply copied and pasted their rest stop design. I averted my eyes and sped up, continuing along the highway. I drove for another 2 hours, and by that point the sun had long since set and had been replaced by the moon and stars above. Admiring the clear starry sky overhead, my eyes drifted down, and I saw it again. That same exact sign. Rest stop in 5 miles. While I didn't want to stop at this place again, simply because this whole area has been giving me the heebie-jeebies, I had been driving pretty much non-stop since I left. I needed a break. Again, the same building appeared on the horizon, and against my better judgment, I pulled into the parking lot. As I parked my car, my eyes drifted to the left, and I saw that same exact truck from before, in the same exact spot as before. I squinted my eyes a bit, but it was now far too dark to see if anyone was inside. I sighed aloud, not wanting to be here any longer than necessary. I went to reach for the door handle, but then I stopped. That feeling from earlier, that feeling of eyes on me came back. There was someone standing in front of my car's headlights. Whoever it was wasn't there a moment ago. I turned and looked at them. It was a man, just standing there in front of my car. He seemed to be wearing sunglasses, though it was quite odd given it was the middle of the night. He wasn't moving. His arms hung limply at his side. I was about to roll down my window and call out to him asking what his problem was, but then one of his arms began to move. It slowly lifted to his face and peeled away his dark sunglasses. His eyes were missing. 2 black recesses in his skull faced me, and despite his eyeless appearance, it still felt like he could see me, like he was looking into my soul. He continued standing there, not moving a single muscle aside from removing his sunglasses. The leather on my steering wheel began to creak and groan as I gripped it tighter and tighter. Then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. He was no longer standing in front of my car, like he had been a mirage this entire time. I exhaled a deep breath, trying to gasp the air back in a moment later. My heart ached as it pounded in my chest. Then, that feeling came back. That feeling of eyes watching me. I slowly turned to my left. Those two empty recesses were inches away from my driver's side window. I was so close to him. I could see the reddish-black skin shifting around, as if there were still eyes inside looking at me. He pressed a single hand on my window and I screamed as loud as I could. I slammed my car in reverse and nearly crashed trying to spin my car around. I drove towards the exit of the rest stop, and instead of continuing in the direction I had been, I turned left and decided to drive the other way this time. For nearly 45 minutes of driving, I could barely control my breathing. Every time I'd think I had gotten it under control, I'd lose a breath of air, and another breathing fit would take hold of me. I could barely bring myself to think about those empty eyes, let alone start rationalizing what that thing was. I drove for another hour before I spotted something up ahead on the right. It was a small roadside diner. A large sign out front said open 24 hours a day. I immediately pulled inside and parked. I just sat in my car for a few minutes trying to collect my thoughts. During that time, I kept looking back over my shoulder to make sure whatever that thing was hadn't followed me. I stepped outside and entered the diner. A small bell announced my arrival, and I saw that inside was virtually empty. There was a single man who seemed to be a trucker, sitting at the counter sipping coffee and reading a newspaper. He gave me a passing glance and continued reading. A moment later, a waitress came rushing out of the back and told me to grab a seat anywhere. I spotted a booth near the back and quickly walked over to it. I sat down, rubbing my hands together in an effort to shake off my nerves. The waitress came over to the booth and asked if she could get me anything. With a slightly trembling voice, I just asked for a cup of coffee. A few moments later, she returned, cup in hand. Taking note of my clearly unsettled appearance, she asked me if anything was the matter. I just told her I'd been driving on Route 83 for a few hours and needed a break. When I said that, she returned a puzzled look. She asked me if I was sure I was on Route 83, and when she asked that, I noticed the trucker turn and raise an eyebrow to my statement as well. I nodded to her, and then she told me something odd. She said that most of Route 83 had been closed for a few weeks now, that there are roadblocks and signs all over the route itself. She said that there is an ongoing investigation into a slew of recent disappearances along Route 83. Disappearances that all seem to be happening in one specific area, near a lone rest stop. I live in a quiet little neighborhood just outside of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of place that is close enough to the city for me to travel easily to work, but far enough removed from downtown that I don't have to deal with bumper-to-bumper traffic, just trying to get to the grocery store. Until recently, I had been assigned to the night shift where I work. One of those dock-in-the-box 24-hour urgent care clinics on nearly every corner that people go to in the middle of the night, when they don't want to go to the hospital for their food poisoning or questionable injuries. About a week ago, the center manager for the day shift went on maternity leave about a month early, leaving the position woefully unattended and in desperate need of replacement. The night shift is a surprisingly docile time of night for our facility, so upper management decided that my talents would be more efficiently applied if I were to fill the role in her absence, instead of continuing my regular duties as the night shift center manager. Normally, I would have been aggravated at a sudden change like this being forced on me without management consulting me first. But, fortunately for them, I had actually been mulling over the idea of asking for a daytime position for a few weeks now. Being nocturnal was starting to throw a wrench in my social life, as well as taking a toll on my mental and physical health. During fall and winter, there were many days where I never even got to see the sunlight, because I was waking up after the sun had set and going to bed just before it would rise. On certain weekend nights and holidays, I would be one of the only employees in the clinic, so I would go days without any kind of social interaction or sunlight. You don't think that kind of thing would have that much effect on you, but after 2 years of this routine, I was definitely getting burnt out. The nocturnal life just wasn't for me, so I was actually excited at the opportunity to transition to the day shift. The first couple of days were the hardest. Fortunately, I had a 2-day buffer between my last night shift and the first day shift that I was expected to work, which made the switch a bit less painful than it probably would have been if I was getting off work at 5 a.m., only to go back into work at 8 a.m. But nevertheless, there still was no perfect method of transitioning my schedule in under 48 hours. I toyed with quite a few ideas, but decided on staying up for the entire day following my last night shift, and going to bed that evening when I was painfully exhausted, thus forcing myself to adhere to a new sleep schedule. After coming home from my last night shift, I pulled into the driveway around 5:30 a.m., having stopped at a local fast food drive-thru to pick myself up some breakfast to celebrate my transformation into a diurnal member of society. I got out of my car and leaned back inside to grab my greasy cheese and sausage English muffin from the passenger side when I was startled to see my next-door neighbor staring at me from his porch. He was standing with one hand in his pocket, a cup of coffee in his other hand. A wide and sincere teeth-baring smile plastered across his face. Upon noticing my startled reaction, he seemed to chuckle to himself, raising his coffee mug to me in a gesture of greeting and acknowledgement, as if to say, "I've been standing here since before you ever got home. You're the one who just noticed me, you weirdo." I forced an awkward chuckle and half smile myself, not wanting to be that guy that finds other people's routines weird or shocking. After all, I was the one who hadn't seen the sun for nearly 6 days in a row. Stopping at the drive-thru had me arriving home 15 minutes later than usual anyway, due to the early morning breakfast rush. Maybe this guy's routine was always just to be up and enjoying his morning coffee at 5:30 a.m. on his front porch, and I had always just barely missed him. I had the feeling that I would be noticing all sorts of weird things about the activity of my daytime counterparts. After a few seconds of awkward silent good morning grunts and gestures, I took my sandwich inside and changed out of my scrubs. Instead of changing into my comfortable sleeping clothes, I opted for my day-off jeans and a t-shirt. If I wanted to trick my brain into thinking I was a member of the sunlight-dwelling general population, I needed to dress the part. I didn't want to risk falling asleep out of habit and having to restart the entire process again tomorrow. I plopped down onto the couch with my greasy breakfast food and grabbed a bottle of iced coffee from the fridge. I turned on my TV and scrolled around Netflix until finally giving up and deciding to re-watch The Office for the 100th time. Unfortunately for me, even the combination of breakfast food and caffeine wasn't enough to trick my brain into thinking that it wasn't time for me to go to bed. I found myself starting to doze off as I scrolled through Twitter on my phone while half-heartedly listening to the antics of Michael Scott and the other colorful characters at Dunder Mifflin. Just before catching myself doing the "I totally wasn't sleeping just now" head jolt that people often do while dozing off in inappropriate places, I decided to get up and walk around to get my blood flowing and snap myself out of it. I stretched and walked my trash into the kitchen before wandering to the window by my front door and taking a peek outside. It was about 6:15 in the morning now, and the sun was just starting to turn the sky a pale shade of red instead of the milky black color I was used to seeing upon returning home from work. At the end of the street, I saw a kid riding a bike throwing newspapers to a few of the houses. After wondering to myself if anyone still actually reads the newspaper, my attention was turned to my neighbor, who was still standing exactly where I had left him, coffee cup in hand, smiling from ear to ear. As the young man on the bike passed by my neighbor's house, he had set the coffee cup down and was already halfway down the driveway to snatch the newspaper up. I guess that answers my previous question, I thought to myself before being immediately startled as my neighbor whipped around, newspaper in hand, smile on his face, making direct eye contact with me as I stared from my window. My stomach dropped, and at first, I thought it was because I had just been caught in what appeared to be a very compromising and creepy position. But as a few seconds passed, I realized that the feeling in the pit of my stomach wasn't the shame of being caught, but instead it was that churning feeling you get when you know someone's about to give you bad news, or when you've seen something that you shouldn't have. To lessen the awkward tension, I raised one hand in a half-hearted wave again and smiled weakly. My neighbor, still smiling, gripped the newspaper in one hand and offered a hearty dad-style, "Hey there," hand raise with the other. Then he just stood there, holding his newspaper and smiling at me. Oof, I thought. Maybe the daytime isn't for me after all. I let out a nervous chuckle to myself and closed the curtains. The interaction had been painfully uncomfortable, for me at least, and wasn't really the way I had planned on starting my new life as a sunlight-dwelling member of society. I went back into the living room and switched from Netflix to a video game so I could keep myself occupied. This made my first day tolerable, and I managed to actually keep myself awake until 8 p.m., where I subsequently passed out for the rest of the night. Since I had gone to bed so early, I woke up at around 5 a.m., wide awake and ready to take on the day. I would need to work on adjusting the exact hours that I was awake or sleeping to better accommodate a normal social life, but this was a good start. After brushing my teeth and puttering around my kitchen, I realized I didn't have any good breakfast food in my fridge or pantry, something that would need to be resolved immediately if I wanted to be a normal functioning member of daytime society. I put my jacket on and walked out to my car, but not before getting that uneasy, someone is watching you feeling while hitting the unlock button on my keys. I turned to see my neighbor, same position as yesterday, coffee cup in hand in pocket, smile on face. After wondering to myself if he was possibly a hallucinogenic side effect of my brain attempting to transition to an entirely new sleep schedule, I offered another half smile and got into my car. As I pulled away down the street, I caught a glimpse of him in my rearview mirror. To my surprise, he was actually now halfway down the driveway, watching me drive away. That increasingly unsettling smile stretched across his face. I'd love to say that was the last time I had such an encounter with him, but this was a recurring theme that would repeat itself for several more days, until I had finally managed to shift my sleeping schedule from 8 to 5 to 10 to 7, thanks to beginning my stint on the day shift at work. I never had any more bizarre stare-downs with my creepy neighbor, but I always noticed that his newspaper in particular was always taken inside long before anyone else on the street had claimed theirs. I didn't think much about it until yesterday morning. It was my first day off, so I didn't set an alarm and decided to wake up whenever my body woke me up. To my shock, I was awoken by the sound of pounding on my front door at around 8 a.m. There I was, greeted by a detective and a police officer. The sight of flashing red and blue lights and yellow crime scene tape catching the corner of my eye from the front door. After asking them what was going on, they informed me that my next door neighbor had been murdered, and they wanted to know when the last time I had seen them was. I told them it had been a couple of days, and that I had seen him picking up his newspaper a couple days ago. They shared a puzzled look before telling me that my neighbor was in fact a woman, and that the medical examiner estimated that she had been killed at least a week ago due to the state of decomposition. She had lived alone, and her sister had asked the police to come and perform a wellness check after she hadn't returned any of her phone calls or answered the front door when she came to visit. I felt that familiar sinking feeling in my stomach as I asked them if maybe she had a husband or boyfriend that had been staying with her, explaining that I had seen a man there every day who seemed to freely enter and exit as he pleased. They told me that they couldn't divulge that sort of information to me due to the sensitive nature of the crime, but that upon initial inspection of the interior house, it did not appear that more than one person had been living there. After about 20 minutes of questioning, they thanked me and went on their way. I felt sick and disgusted by what I had just learned. After all, I couldn't provide them with any more information than what I had already given them. It's not like I struck up a conversation with the man I had seen or anything. I didn't know anything about him other than that he had a propensity for smiling and snatching newspapers as soon as they hit the ground. Something which I now realized was probably in an effort to avoid suspicion from the prying eyes of other neighbors, as the newspapers would have begun to pile up in my actual neighbor's absence. For the rest of the day, the only thing I could think of was that awful, unsettling smile. How that whack job had looked at me in the eyes and had gone about his business, all while my actual neighbor was inside, probably in the early stages of decomposition. Looking back, the warning signs were probably there. Maybe it's just hindsight, but in my memory, I distinctly remember that in all of our limited interactions, the man was wearing the same exact clothes. That should have been a red flag. But honestly, it was pretty low on the list of creepy things about the guy. That was yesterday, and I know I shouldn't beat myself up about it, but I seriously wish there was more I could give the police. The fact that they didn't even know anything about the suspect being around the house told me that they definitely didn't know enough to have caught him yet. I had a hard time sleeping last night, so I'm up pretty early again. I thought I might go to my local 24-hour diner to clear my head, but as I was leaving my neighborhood, I noticed one of the front doors opening to a house down the street, and someone walking outside in my rearview mirror. I was already pretty far away, and maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I could have sworn that in the reflection, I saw the subtle white gleam of someone smiling at me as they watched me drive away. I just returned home from a business trip out of state, and it was by far the weirdest experience of my life. A few years ago, when I was in college, I'd met this guy in one of my classes. He was sitting in the back of the classroom next to the only open seat available. I sat down and he introduced himself. He told me that his name was Chris. Although I wasn't in a particularly talkative mood, Chris had this strange charisma about himself that made speaking with him rather engaging. We chatted for a little while, and before I knew it, the bell had rung. We both said our goodbyes and headed off to our other classes. The following days, Chris and I would sit next to each other and spend the majority of the class just talking about whatever. The more I spoke with him, the more I began to realize just how similar we were. We had the same sense of humor, the same interests, the same likes and dislikes. It was kind of unsettling just how much alike we were. It was almost as if we had been friends since grade school. I suppose it just goes to show that the world isn't as big as we like to think. About halfway through the term, the holidays were fast approaching. Chris told me he was heading back home to visit his family for vacation. This took me by surprise, as I was sure he was going to tell me that he lived in the house right next door to mine. He said he lived in a small town 2 states over and that he was just here for school. I knew people traveled all over the country for higher education, it just never crossed my mind that he was one of them. Eventually, the school year ended. Chris and I had separate classes from that point forward, so we saw very little of each other. We still kept in touch through social media and the like, but we hadn't really spoken face to face for some time. During my 3rd year in college, Chris found me in the halls and told me that he was heading back home. He wished me all the best and told me that if I was ever in his town, to look him up. I thanked him for the kind offer and wished him a safe journey home. Fast forward a bit. I had graduated college, gotten my degree, and had gotten a job working as a consultant for a tech company. For the most part, my job was just basically traveling from city to city, stopping at all of the subsidiaries and branches, making sure everything was up to code. While the traveling could be very monotonous at times, overall, I really enjoyed it. I got to travel across the country visiting all the major metropolitan cities. I probably wouldn't have even left my own state if it wasn't for this job. Not to mention the pay was rather nice as well. About a month ago, I had received my next location. It was for a city I hadn't been to, but when I looked it up, I remember that Chris told me he had lived not too far away from there. So, before my trip, I contacted him and asked him what he was up to. After a few minutes of catching up, I told him about my job and that it would be taking me through his state. He told me that I had to swing by and that he wouldn't take no for an answer. Usually when I travel, my job gives me quite a bit of time to take care of everything I need to before I have to fly back home. Apparently, the person who held this job before me took a while completing assignments, so the company compensated for it by extending his travel time. Whether intentional or not, that was actually a huge bonus for me, as I've often completed the job within a day or two, then fly back when I'm required. This gives me quite a bit of free time to see the sights and do basically whatever. After flying into the city in the morning, I quickly rented a car and drove directly to the main office. I spoke with the senior manager for a bit before they put me in a side office with a laptop and a few boxes. By the end of the workday, I had completed my entire inspection, typed up my report, and left. I was going to get a hotel for the duration, but during my talk with Chris, he told me to just stay at his place free of charge. I mulled it over while I was in the midst of paperwork and decided why the hell not. I texted him and he gave me his address shortly after. It was nearly a 2-hour drive out to his town, but that didn't bother me in the slightest. After all, I had nothing better to do. As I drove along, I noticed how rural the scenery quickly became. The transition between the large city and the sparsely populated countryside was night and day. By the time I reached Chris's town, the sun had already partially set. It took me a bit of time to find the correct house, even with my GPS helping me out. All of the houses in this area looked identical, like they were all part of some sort of weird subdivision. Upon finding the correct house, I walked up and knocked. A minute later, I was greeted by Chris. He welcomed me with open arms and I entered. Although Chris was the nicest guy you'd ever meet, I did have the thought in the back of my mind that he might actually be a serial killer. Looking around his house, though, put me at ease. His house was the epitome of the phrase bachelor pad. Movie posters and various sports memorabilia adorned his walls. He had a giant TV and a fridge stocked with all sorts of beer. We spent the evening drinking and watching old sports recaps on his TV. Then, after a couple of hours, he told me he was getting tired. He showed me to the guest bedroom and bid me goodnight. Surprisingly, I slept peacefully throughout the night. Then, at around 6 o'clock in the morning, I was awoken to the sound of sirens echoing from outside. They weren't police or ambulance sirens, they were different. They sounded like some sort of severe weather warning system. The sound carried across the entire town. I tiredly cracked open my eyes and looked around, forgetting where I was momentarily. Then a second later, I heard the front door open and close. Curious, I got out of bed and walked over to his front door myself. As I did, I passed by his large living room window, and I froze in my tracks. I turned and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There were people. A lot of people. All just standing there a few feet away from their houses. They all seemed to be standing very rigidly. The posture was very militaristic. I had absolutely no idea what was going on. I stared with my jaw nearly on the floor for 20 minutes. Then, suddenly, all of the people turned around and entered their homes. My eyes snapped to the front door and I saw Chris walk in. He greeted me with a surprised good morning and I just returned a nervous wave. Throughout the morning, he didn't say anything regarding what took place. He just went about the day as if it never happened. I thought about bringing it up, but I wasn't entirely sure how to. We hung out for the rest of the day, and while that sight was very odd, it lasted only a brief moment, and nothing seemed to come of it. I tried to rationalize it in my head. Like, it would be no different than people going out to get the morning paper at the same exact time, then standing out there for 20 minutes without moving. Yeah, no different at all. Regardless, I tried not to let what happened get to me. Instead, I put it in the back of my mind and relaxed a bit. That was until 6 p.m. rolled around. The sun was already setting when I heard that same familiar siren echo in the distance. I looked over to Chris, who was sitting adjacent to me, and I playfully asked him what that noise was. He looked back at me with an expression I hadn't seen him make before. Chris, who was normally all smiles and sunshine, turned to me with a look absent of emotion, like his mind had been wiped clean. He stood up from his chair, walked over to the door, and stepped outside. Curious as to what was going on, I got up and followed him out of the door. I walked towards Chris, while simultaneously keeping an eye on all the other people who were now standing outside. I stepped in front of him and looked him directly in the eyes. What were previously bright blue eyes were now a dark shade of black. I could feel a chill running down my spine. I quietly made my way back into the house, and a few minutes later, Chris entered and asked me if I wanted another beer. In that moment, I confronted him, asking him why he and the other townsfolk stand outside their houses at 6 in the morning and at night. He just returned a bewildered look and asked me what I meant. I told him what I saw, and he just said that he hadn't gone outside at all today. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told Chris that I was probably just tired and that I needed to head to bed before heading back to work the next day. He asked me if I was sure, and I nodded. Well, he didn't understand what I was talking about earlier. He said it was a shame that I had to go, but that he understood. The next morning, I woke up very early and packed my stuff. When I threw my bag into my car and was getting ready to leave, I heard those sirens once again. I turned to look, and all of the people slowly began funneling out of their homes like zombies. What's weird is that while I sat in my car watching, I had this twinge in the back of my mind to go outside and do the same, like a voice beckoning me to come outside. I shook the thought from my head and drove back to the city. I have never experienced anything like that in all my life. During my flight back home, I decided to write this out because every time I try to recollect what happened, the memory just seems fuzzier and fuzzier, like a dream that you forget the more you try to remember. I haven't spoken to Chris since then, and I'm not sure if I'm going to again. I don't know what those sirens are, or why the people seem to be brainwashed to stand outside, but one thing's for sure. The next time I hear random sirens echoing in a town, I'm not sticking around to find out why. I hate the airport. I couldn't help but think that as I stood in yet another baggage check line. The sounds of whirring belts and the clattering of shoes on the hard ground filled the space around me. Parents nearby trying to calm their disgruntled children as they fought and screamed with all their might. The elderly in front of me moving like molasses, bringing everything around them to a standstill. The clerks at each of the counters, giving off 1,000-yard stares if they all had just served in a hellish war. Although my disdain for this place was great, it was a necessary evil that I had to face for my job. It's hard to be a traveling consultant if, well, I'm not traveling. Some of you might ask why I don't find some other work, and while that is an option, Most starting positions wouldn't give me the salary or benefits I am currently receiving. I walked up to the counter and handed the woman my ticket and ID. She never made eye contact with me the entire time. She just punched the keys on her computer before asking me to set my bags down on the scale. I hoisted them up and set them down. A few moments later, she printed out some tags and placed my bags on the conveyor belt behind her. She handed me my receipt and told me to enjoy my flight. Despite all my misgivings about air travel, I was planning on enjoying this flight, as I had been traveling basically non-stop since the beginning of the year, flying all over the country and performing inspections at the various locations owned by my company. This time, however, I was flying back home to enjoy an entire month off from work. After passing through security, I made my way over to my gate. I was early, so I had to find a seat nearby to wait for my plane to land. I ended up having to sit in between a family whose kids seemed to be shouting at an iPad at irregular intervals, and a man shoveling some form of a sandwich into his face. I shifted and turned my attention to my phone, in an effort to block out everything around me. Time seemed to blur, and I was startled out of my scrolling by a voice announcing that they were going to start boarding soon. I snapped my attention up and looked around. I glanced towards the nearby window and saw that the plane was sitting at the gate as if it had been there the whole time. I rubbed my eyes before standing up and making my way over to the gate. One by one, we all filed into that small hallway that led to the plane itself. As I stood on the cusp of the connector and the plane, I couldn't help but feel a strange shift in the air around me. It only lasted for a fraction of a second, but it was like the air felt 10 times heavier than normal, before immediately dissipating. I filed back towards my seat and sat down. I then began my usual routine of silently praying for decent passengers around me. Though my prayers were rarely answered, after a few moments, the flight attendants shut the doors. I looked around and saw that the plane was actually fairly empty. There were still some passengers about, but the plane wasn't packed. There was only one person to my right, and he seemed like a younger man, in his early 20s. He sat there and scrolled on his phone much like I had been earlier. I thanked the benevolent gods and glanced out of the window, as the attendants began to rattle off flight procedures. After the demonstration, the plane began to taxi onto the runway. A few nerve-wracking seconds passed before my upper body had become compressed into my seat. Before I knew it, the plane was already leveling out in the sky. I stared out of the window as the ground slowly faded beneath the clouds. I checked my watch before shutting the window next to me and closing my eyes. I never used to be able to sleep on planes. Something about having people constantly around me, and the intermittent turbulence. But after a few years of this job, I had quickly learned how to block everything out and drift off. Shortly after I had fallen asleep, I was jolted awake by the plane shaking violently. I leaned forward and groggily opened my eyes. The plane was clearly hitting some heavy turbulence, but this was far more than I had ever experienced before. After a few nauseating seconds, the plane evened out and the shaking stopped. I looked around, and that's when I noticed something was off. The young man that was sitting next to me was no longer looking down at his phone. He was staring at the seat in front of him. Still desperately trying to wake up, I glanced down at my watch. It took me a moment to realize that the hands on my watch hadn't moved since we had taken off. I shook my wrist before bringing my watch to my ear. Battery must have died, I thought. I slid up the screen on the window and looked outside. I felt my heart seize in my chest as my brain tried to make sense out of what I was seeing. The sky was black. There were no clouds, just an empty void. I looked down, and there was nothing. No ground, no water, just darkness. This didn't make sense to me for multiple reasons aside from the obvious. My flight was only supposed to be 2.5 hours. I boarded my plane at 1:30 p.m., so there was no way it should be this dark outside, even if we were flying through a storm. I sat back in my seat and rubbed my eyes once again. I tried to look past the seats in front of me, and every single person was doing the same thing as the guy sitting next to me. They were all staring straight ahead. I wasn't sure what was going on. I pulled out my phone and attempted to turn it on. The screen glowed briefly for a few seconds before going dark again. I was beginning to think that I was still asleep, that this was all just a very vivid dream. Then I heard a noise which drew my attention behind me. It sounded like someone cracking their knuckles. I turned and peeked through the small space in my chair. There was something at the back of the plane. It was standing in the aisle. It was difficult to see because towards the back of the plane was completely dark, as if all the lights in the rear of the cabin had been snuffed out. It was tall and thin, with its head nearly scraping the roof of the cabin. Its long fingers cracked and popped as it placed its hands on the seat next to it. That was the sound that had drew my attention. It would stop, lean down into one of the aisles, then return back to its previously standing position. As it moved down the aisle, the lights would flicker out one by one. Upon leaning into another aisle, as it was returning to its standing position, its eyes seemed to lock with mine through the small crack in my seat. I snapped forward, and I could feel sweat beginning to bead on my forehead. I shut my eyes tightly, hoping to God that I would just wake up, and I'd be safely back on the ground. I opened my eyes once again, and just as I did, the lights above me flickered out. That thing was getting closer. It finally reached my aisle, and it was standing just inches away from the man to my right. I opened my eyes and stared straight ahead, not daring to blink. It bent down and leaned in. Through the corner of my eye, I could see its face clearly. Its head was grotesque. It was like it was rotting. Its skin was gray and marred with scratches and missing flesh. My grip on the armrest tightened as I looked towards the lower half of its face. It was gone. Its entire lower jaw was missing. A slimy black tongue just hung loosely from the back of its neck. It seemed to stare into the man's eyes for a few seconds, before turning its attention to me. Its neck seemed to extend all on its own, and its head floated directly in front of me. I quieted my breathing and stared blankly ahead. My calm demeanor was just a product of the paralyzing fear I was currently under. It looked me in the eyes, and I could see that its eyes were a ghostly shade of white. It had no pupils whatsoever. The seconds passing by felt like an eternity. Then, its neck began to retract, and it continued on down the aisle. I let out a shaky breath, and watched as it repeated this process for each aisle. Then, suddenly, it stopped at an aisle a few feet ahead, and a loud shriek filled the cabin. It reached in and ripped someone out of their seat. It dragged them into the very center of the aisle, before vanishing in a cloud of black smoke. The plane began to shake violently once more, and I shut my eyes praying for it to stop. When it finally did, I opened them again, and saw that there was light peeking through the window on my left. I looked to my right and saw the young man was staring at his phone. He turned and saw that I was drenched in sweat, and had a panicked look on my face. He then asked me if I was all right. I exhaled heavily and nodded, telling him I just had a bad dream. The plane eventually landed, and as I was disembarking, I stopped next to the seat where the creature had made that terrible noise. The seats were completely empty, but I noticed that on one of them, the seatbelt had been torn in half. I swallowed my nerves and exited the plane. When I was finally back on the ground, I walked over to a wall and just leaned against it for a bit. I pulled my phone out and looked at it. Something instantly caught my attention. It was the date. An entire week had passed since I had gotten on that plane. I had arrived at the airport at 1:30 p.m. on Sunday, and it was now 4:15 p.m. on Saturday. I checked my tickets and they all say 1:30 p.m. Saturday the 7th, but I know that isn't right, because I had completed my consultation on Saturday the 29th of February, and my flight home was the next day. I checked all my travel info and they all said the same thing, that my departure time was Saturday the 7th at 1:30 p.m. I sighed and wondered if I had simply gotten my dates mixed up. But then, I looked down at my wrist. My watch, which had died during the flight, it was still dead. But as I looked at the small face, in the tiny little box that shows the date, it showed a 1. I have so many questions. Like, what was that thing? Where did it come from? Why did it target that random person, and where did it take them to? Why did we all lose a week of our lives, but none of the other passengers seemed to notice? Nothing about that flight makes any sense. Regardless, I think during my time off from work, I'm going to apply for a new position, so I never have to step foot inside an airport. Ever. Again. I should start off by saying that I've lived in the same exact house my entire life. I know that might not seem unusual, but it's necessary for you to understand. For 19 years, no one else has lived in this house aside from my mother, my brother, and myself. My father passed away a few years after I was born, so it's been the three of us here ever since. Our house is settled in the middle of the suburbs in a small town in central Michigan. The town was just your average run-of-the-mill slice of Americana. It wasn't a bad place to spend one's childhood, though I honestly don't have much else to compare it to. My parents both grew up in the state and met each other during their time in college. My brother, who's a year older than me, was somewhat unexpected, as my mother liked to put it. So it forced my parents to relocate to a more permanent means of living. They bought this quaint, unassuming home on the corner of a small neighborhood block. I always thought our house was unique as it didn't look like any of the other houses that stretched down the road. Our house, according to the realtor, was built in the 60s, where all the other houses were constructed sometime later, sporting more modern exteriors. A year after my parents closed on the house, I was born. Like I mentioned previously, everything was normal. Our lives journeyed on like I'm sure many others, until my 4th birthday, that is. My father was, from what I've been told, a jovial man. Every photo I've seen of him was always full of smiles and warmth. My mother told me he was a steelworker at a processing plant in the city. The job was difficult, but that didn't matter to him as long as he could provide for his family. Then, when my 4th birthday rolled around, he was on his way home after pulling a double shift at work. A drunk driver swerved into the oncoming lane, and both cars collided head-on. There were no survivors. To say it was a lousy birthday would be an understatement. I know I shouldn't joke, but humor had a way of lessening the pain. Honestly, at the time, I couldn't really process the devastation. Our mother was beside herself with grief, and for a few months my brother and I had to go stay with extended family, while our mother got the affairs in order. Around a year after the funeral, our lives started to reclaim a modicum of normalcy. We started school, which helped greatly in drawing our attention away from the past. Before we knew it, the incident became a solemn memory that we all shared but never discussed. After high school, my brother got a football scholarship to go play at a university, an opportunity both my mother and I were amazed and proud of. I, on the other hand, wasn't very skilled in athletics, but my brother was a natural at it. He had gotten a full ride to go play in college, so he was forced to leave and live on campus. The house felt lifeless without my brother here. Yet, despite the desolation, we were happy for him. I, on the other hand, had started my own personal business as a photographer. I started selling my services about halfway through high school, mostly to just friends and family. After nearly 3 years, I had designed myself a website and formed a decent portfolio. After school, it felt like every week I was either shooting a wedding, birthday, or some office work party. Since I basically worked from home, I had an abundance of time to spend around the house. I did a lot of the housework that my mother was too busy to get to. Then, one weekend my mother came to me with a request. She told me that there was a lot of stuff up in the attic that needed to be brought down so she could donate. She explained that it was just a handful of boxes, but some were too heavy for her to manage on her own. I told her to say no more and I'd head up there right away and bring down what I could. I pulled down the stairs that led up to the attic and ascended them. Immediately I was hit with a wave of heat and stale air. I could already feel sweat forming on my face after only being up there for a few moments. I looked around and spotted all the boxes stacked in a single corner. One by one, I carried the boxes down the stairs and set them in the living room. It wasn't long until there was only a single box remaining. I climbed the stairs one last time and crouched my way all the way to the back of the attic. As I knelt down to hoist the box up, I saw something glinting from the faint sunlight peeking through the cracks in the siding. I laid on the ground and crawled my way over to the glinting object. I reached between 2 pieces of wood and fished out whatever it was that was shining. As I pulled it into view, I saw that it was a VHS tape. I blew on it and a wall of dust drifted off, dancing in the sunbeams. The tape looked ancient, not to mention I haven't seen a VHS tape since I was a child. There were no markings or labels to indicate what was on the tape, so I just set it on the box and carried them both down. After clearing out the attic, I couldn't shake my curiosity about the tape. I remembered we used to have an old VCR that my mother couldn't bring herself to throw out. She kept it in the garage. After taking a few moments to locate and retrieve it, I took both the VCR and the tape to my room. It took me a little while to hook everything up. By that time, the sun had set, and I could already hear the nocturnal sounds of nature echoing outside my window. I pushed the tape into the VCR and pressed the rewind button. Honestly, I wasn't sure what to expect. I was pretty sure that the tape would either be blank or simply wouldn't work. A moment later, I heard a click indicating that the tape was finished rewinding. I pressed play and sat back, waiting. The screen crackled to life, though only a blank screen with faint static appeared. This continued for a few minutes. I thought my previous assumption was correct, that the tape had decayed from being up in the attic for so long. Then a scene appeared. It was our family. We were all relaxing outside on a warm summer day. My brother and I were playing with a hose, while my mother lounged on a lawn chair in the yard. I almost felt tears forming when I realized who was filming. It had to have been Dad, before the accident. The scene faded and a new one appeared. This time we were all slightly older. We were sitting around a Christmas tree opening presents. Everyone was laughing at my brother who covered himself in tinsel. Seeing all these snapshots from the past was both tragic and incredible. The scene faded to black once more, and another came into view. This time my brother and I were much older. We were standing outside of our house with our mother. I recognized the outfit I was wearing immediately. It was the first day of high school. A smile crept across my face. Then it immediately vanished when I realized that none of this made any sense. My father passed away when I was 4. So who was filming us? The cameraman was standing clearly in the front yard, so we surely would have seen them filming us. But thinking back, I didn't remember anyone else being there that day. The image disappeared and a static-filled blackness returned. I thought that might be the end of the tape, but after a few minutes, something slowly started to appear. This time, the camera was pointing towards the back of our house from the nearby tree line. I could see myself, again older, and I was standing out in the backyard. I was holding a camera, taking photos and testing the lens. I had just received it as a gift from my mother for graduating high school. I watched as I turned, taking photos of the trees that decorated our backyard. I aimed my new camera right in the direction of whoever was filming and snapped a picture. I couldn't see any recognition on my face as if I had spotted someone, though I don't see how I could miss someone standing clearly there filming me. I thought back to when I had received the camera, and I couldn't recall anyone else being there aside from me. The film then stuttered for a few seconds and shut off. I sat there in silence wondering who could have made this video. That's when I remembered that, ever since I received my new camera, I've backed up every photo I've taken with it. Something I've gotten into the habit of as I've found many gems that I didn't realize I've captured. I walked over to my computer and booted it up. After a few long minutes, my desktop appeared, and I opened up my cloud drive. I scrolled down the list for nearly 20 minutes before coming to the end, or I should say, the beginning. I recognized the photos of our backyard almost immediately. I opened each photo and scanned them closely. None of them looked out of the ordinary. That's when I opened the last photo of the set. Standing in between two trees was a figure. It appeared to be a man. He was wearing dark blue jeans and a bright red flannel shirt. He seemed to be holding something, but the photo was partially blurred at hand level. I'm assuming it was the video camera. I could feel my palms tense up as I stared at the person's face, however. The face was contorted into a hellish expression of pain and anguish. The head was tilted to one side, and whoever it was appeared to be screaming. As soon as I zoomed in on the photo to get a better look, the power to my house went out. I sat there in the dark for a few moments wondering what the hell was going on. My mother called out asking if I was alright, and I shouted back that everything was fine. A couple minutes passed, and the power returned. My computer booted back up and I attempted to relocate the image, but upon scouring my files for nearly 30 minutes, I couldn't find it. It was like that photo had been wiped from existence. I ran back over to the VCR and made sure the tape was still in there. I played the tape once again, and everything appeared normally. Well, as normal as it could be. I have no idea what's going on or how any of this is even possible. I have a million questions racing through my mind. Like, how was this tape even made? Despite having footage from a year ago, the tape appeared over a decade old. How did it end up in the attic? But, most importantly, who was actually recording? Just then, my mother opened the door and asked me if I was doing all right. I returned a shaky nod. She then handed me something and I could feel my muscles tighten as I looked at it. It was a bright red flannel t-shirt, the same exact one as the man in the photo was wearing. I turned to her, speechless, and she just said, "This was your father's. It was his favorite shirt. I found it in one of the boxes from the attic. I thought that you might like to have it." There are many famous horror legends throughout the world. I'm willing to bet you've heard of at least one of them. Bloody Mary, the Hook Man, the Slit-Mouthed Woman. The list goes on and on. I'm here to tell you about one you might not have heard of before. One that very few people have, in fact. Well, outside of my town, that is. It's called the Wanderer. In my small suburban town, I quickly learned of this legend. It was quite the topic spoken about throughout elementary school. Kids on the playground would use this story to terrorize anyone younger than themselves. I should know. I was one of the kids being terrorized. It was a form of psychological torment I was not accustomed to. I remember the very first time I ever heard of it. I was in the 6th grade, and I was hanging out with my friends at our school playground one summer evening. While we played various games and caused a ruckus on the jungle gym, we drew the attention of some passers-by, a group of slightly older kids on bikes. They all stopped when they heard our commotion and began pedaling over to us. As they approached, the snarky leader of the bunch asked us what we were doing out here so late at night. We all looked to one another. There were more of us than there were of them, but still their size intimidated us. One of us responded saying we were just playing. The older kid leaned forward onto his handlebars and winced at our response. He said we shouldn't be so careless this late in the evening. Most of us just brushed him off. But I was curious. I asked him why. He looked around over his shoulders and to his goons on either side of him. He said in a very low voice, a voice that drew me in, one that made me want to listen even more. He said, "The Wanderer is out there." A few of us turned to one another and giggled, but not me. I asked him what the Wanderer was, and he simply leaned back on his bike. He said, "The Wanderer is a young woman who walks along roads and vacant areas at night. Anyone unlucky enough to cross her path, well, they get their body torn limb from limb. She peels the skin off the flesh, and one by one, devours your eyes." As the kid spoke, I heard my companions behind me stifle their voices. A hush fell across the whole playground, save for a light gust of wind. He looked me dead in my eyes and said, "You need to leave before she finds you." The older kids then pedaled off, laughing and carrying on. Some of us took his words as hollow threats, but there was something about that story that stuck with me. It stuck with me so much, in fact, that I ended up leaving the playground shortly after and running straight home. That night, I laid in my bed unable to sleep. It seemed like every shape on my wall, every shadow cast from the light outside, seemed to transform into a grotesque monstrosity that wanted to tear the flesh from my very bones. As I got older, I heard that same legend more and more often. Every time I heard it, the person telling the story would take creative liberties. At first, it was just a young woman walking through vacant areas. Then it was a young boy who lured people out into the woods, never to be seen or heard from again. Then, eventually, it just became a hulking beast that simply crushes people with a single blow. One thing about the story did remain a constant, however. You had to be outside at night to run into it. Sitting at my desk, I scrolled mindlessly on Facebook while I waited for my work shift to end. The minutes were ticking by at an agonizing pace. As the hours eventually started to pass and I was nearing the end of my shift, my boss walked up to me. He asked if I had finished all my work for the day. I nodded nonchalantly as he just tapped a finger against my desk. He then proceeded to slam a stack of files in front of me. He told me that he needed these sheets inputted into our company system by tonight. I complained that my shift was almost over already, and that there was no way I'd be able to finish in time. He said that it wasn't his problem. Honestly, I thought about simply walking out then and there, but he mentioned that I'd be looking for a new job if I did that. That he could fire me for wasting company time. If I wasn't so desperately in need of a job, I probably wouldn't have cared. I sulked down in my chair as he moseyed back into his office. As I finished sheet after sheet, I watched as my coworkers began to depart one by one. Before I knew it, it was just my boss and myself left in the office. I'll give him one thing. At least he had the balls to stick around during the length of my punishment. The clock on my computer read 11:23 p.m., a full 2.5 hours after I was originally supposed to clock out. I finished all the inputs and walked over to my boss. I told him that I was all finished, and he rose out of his chair. He gave me a lecture about using company time wisely, but honestly, I wasn't really paying attention. We both left the office together and walked into the parking lot. Our 2 cars were the only ones left. We each got into our respective vehicles and my boss gave me a cursory "see you tomorrow" before driving off before me. I sat in my car and rubbed my eyes for a moment. I started the engine and began my journey home. I lived roughly 30 minutes away from my work, but that was during heavy traffic. I was sure it'd be much faster this late at night. The blinking yellow lights on the construction signs dotting the highway suggested otherwise, however. I had seen them setting this up all week, but I must have forgotten about it. A detour sign directed me off the highway, and with a yawn, I followed. I drove for nearly a half hour on this back road that seemed to go on endlessly. My eyelids were slightly drooping as I struggled to maintain my alertness. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the road. I slammed on my brakes and I could feel my tires lock up underneath me. My car squealed and skidded sideways to a halt. Smoke billowed out from my tires and drifted into the air. It took me a moment to peel my knuckles away from my steering wheel. I opened my door and stepped outside. It was surprisingly warm for being so late at night. I loosened my tie and walked around the front of my car, inspecting it to make sure nothing was damaged. I waved my hand in the air to disperse the smoke. My car's headlights were shining off into the distance. Then, a figure slowly started to appear before me. I'm not sure why, but my mind didn't connect the dots right away. I thought someone might have been injured or lost. I called out to them, asking them if they were all right. They said nothing. They just continued to walk towards me. As they drew closer to me, I could see that it was in fact a woman. Her hair hung like a sheet in front of her face. Upon seeing this, all those stories from my youth came rushing back into the forefront of my mind. I thought about that time at the playground all those years ago, and that kid on his bike. Sweat was beginning to coat my face as I took a step back. I found myself making nervous comments aloud, like, "I'm glad you're okay," and "I'll be leaving now." I turned to head back to my car, and when I did, I felt a warm breath press against the nape of my neck. I jumped forward and spun around. When I did, the woman wasn't there. I looked around closely and couldn't see any sign of her. I thought perhaps it was just one of those repressed memories resurfacing to mess with me. I sighed heavily, almost chuckling as I did so. After wiping the sweat from my eyes, I turned to head back to my car. My legs stiffened. My body locked. She was standing in front of me. She raised her head to me, and her hair parted. She didn't have a face. Well, not in the sense that nothing was there. It was like her face had been torn from her head. Bits of bone poked through the reddish mass. Lidless eyes stared at me, unable to blink. She pressed her hand onto my shoulder as sharp nails dug underneath my collarbone. The pain in my shoulder was screaming at me to run away, but my legs wouldn't respond. I had never been paralyzed with fear before, so all I could do was just watch and pray. Next, Her mouth began to stretch. Cracking of bones and the tearing of muscle could be heard. The jaw extended wider and wider. After only a few seconds, it was already larger than my entire head. As she began to move her mouth towards me, my brain fired a signal asking my body, "What the hell are you doing?" I instantly ducked and fell backwards away from her. I rolled to my side and began crawling to my car as fast as I could. My chest collided with the gravel as I felt something yank on my leg. I turned to see where she was, and the woman was standing quite a distance away from me. But when I looked down, her arm was wound tightly around my ankle. Her arm was inhumanly long, like a snake trying to constrict and reel me in. My nails began to bleed as I struggled to maintain my grip on the road. I kicked at the hand repeatedly, and eventually my shoe slid off, allowing me to slip my leg free. I jumped up and dashed for my car. I got inside, started the engine, and peeled off down the road. The woman didn't move, even after I almost hit her with the car. She just stood in the center of the road, watching me as I drove away. I lied awake all night staring at my bedroom door, wondering if she had followed me home. Eventually, the sun replaced the darkened sky, and it was time for me to go to work. I had considered just calling out sick, but after the previous night with my boss, I didn't want to risk losing my job. When I arrived at work, I found a few of my coworkers standing outside the office. I asked them what was going on, and they told me that our boss had gone missing last night. They said they found his car on the side of the road, abandoned. When I asked them what road, they said it was the one right after the detour on the highway. I felt a pit form in my stomach. It didn't make any sense. He had left before me and had driven on that road first. I should have spotted his car when I was driving down it. Maybe I didn't see it due to my panic-stricken mind. Or maybe something else happened. Something which I might not be able to understand. Like maybe that woman made it so I couldn't see him. I don't know. It's all a blur of insanity at this point. Regardless, I don't know what happened to him, and frankly, I don't want to know. If you ever find yourself traveling at night, and you see someone, anyone, walking alone in the darkness, don't stop, just keep on driving. Or you might very well meet the Wanderer for yourself, and you might not be as lucky as I was. High school. Most people see it as a place of learning, a location where the minds of youth can be molded and shaped to prepare them for life outside those stone walls. Others see it as a lawless wasteland of chaotic hormonal teenagers, just trying to figure out their own place in the world. Some still hold on to that belief that high school was the best 4 years of their lives, as if acne and awkward relationships were the best thing to ever happen to them. My feelings on my school life fall mostly on indifference. While I barely remember my time there, some of the friendships I made I could never forget. Thinking back to the friends I had made in high school and all the crazy antics we got up to, it would always send waves of nostalgia running back through my mind. Unfortunately, shortly after graduating high school, my parents moved around a lot, taking me along with them. During those years, I bounced around from job to job. Eventually, I found one that actually stuck, which was surprising, and I've been working there ever since. The downside was that the job had to relocate me to another city, in a whole nother state. This put me farther away from my family and even farther away from my hometown. Due to this, I fell further and further out of touch with people from my past. People whom I used to call my best friends in school now just seem like former acquaintances. Despite all the advances in technology, I never really put in an effort to maintain connections with anyone from back then. I was always too caught up with my work or responsibilities to give my past much consideration. Time has a funny way of slipping past you when you least expect it to. A few years after joining the company, I had met my wife, Mary, and the years seemed to only pick up even faster. Before I knew it, nearly 20 years had passed since I had set foot in my hometown. One day, I had come home from work, and as I walked through the door, Mary informed me I had received a letter in the mail. I tossed my bag on the couch, poured a stiff drink, and opened the letter. I fully expected it to be yet another new bill to add to the pile, but I paused when I read the header. It said, "Cypress High welcomes you to the 20-year reunion for class of '99. As I sipped from my glass, I continued reading. It went on to mention the reunion was being hosted at the school itself, as well as a date this was to take place. I couldn't help the cheesy grin that spilled onto my face. Although I rarely thought about my past, the sudden abruptness of this letter sent it all flooding back. I was once again standing on those laminated floors between whitewashed walls, listening to that ear-shattering bell, indicating the next period. The scent of industrial floor cleaner from the night before still lingering in the air. The grin was short-lived, however, as I wondered how on earth the school had found my address. It seemed somewhat odd that they were still able to locate me after all this time. I suppose I hadn't truly been keeping myself a secret. I used social media about as much as the next guy, and on some of the sites my previous education had been listed. Before I started to overthink things, Mary spied over my shoulder and read the letter. She chimed in asking me if I was going. I just shrugged with uncertainty as I finished my drink. I told her I still had a lot of work to do at the office, and she just shook her head. She told me that I'd been working basically non-stop for the last 2 years straight, something which I was well aware of. She told me that I needed a break, and this seemed like the perfect excuse. So, after some extended debating, I eventually caved, like I always did when it came to her, and decided I would at least go check it out. If I didn't like it, I could always check into a hotel and spend some time visiting old stomping grounds. I arrived at my hometown a little before sundown. I had around an hour before the event was supposed to occur, so I decided to spend that time driving around my old neighborhood. Each turn down a new street resurfaced a bunch of old memories. I was quite literally cruising down memory lane. Before I knew it, the sun had set, and I realized just how late I had let my sightseeing run. I quickly turned onto the main road and tried my best to navigate back to my old high school. I drove to the edge of town, turned off a couple of side streets, and pulled onto the long, narrow driveway towards the large, darkened building in the distance. As I parked my car, I stared at the high school. It looked like a shell of its former self. The entire building looked weathered, almost run down even. I glanced around and only saw a handful of parked cars in the parking lot, so I just assumed that not many people had chosen to attend. I stepped out of my car and approached the school. The building was just as imposing as I remembered from my youth. I pulled open the front door and walked inside. I was instantly caught off guard by the lightless interior. Hazardous was a word that first came to mind, but I thought they might just be setting up a more atmospheric presentation. As I walked through the halls, I started to feel more and more unsure about this. The school, while visually like I remembered, it didn't quite feel the same. The whole building seemed lifeless, and not just because the lights were off. All of the classroom doors were shut. Dust and grime coated the floor in the lockers, and the place just seemed like it hadn't been used in ages. While it was summer, I had assumed that they had just cut back on maintenance. I rounded one of the corners and saw a faint glow in the distance. There was a light coming from the doors to the gymnasium. I was beginning to feel a bit better after having my assumptions confirmed. I walked a bit quicker, hoping I wasn't too late to the event. My pace began to slow as I noticed something off about the door. There seemed to be some type of liquid pooling underneath it. As soon as I reached the door itself, a loud crash echoed from inside the gym, and the doors suddenly burst open. A man came flying out of the gym towards me, and I quickly backed up. The man slipped on the liquid and fell to the ground. When he did, I turned to look inside the gym, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The light, that I had first thought was ambient lighting, was numerous candles placed all along the floor. Amongst those candles were bodies. Bodies of various people were all lying on the ground. And on top of each of them was something. They looked strangely humanoid, but they clearly weren't human. Their forms were completely silver, like their bodies were made out of mirrors. Their fingers looked like jagged shards of glass, and were each piercing the chest of the people on the ground. They were all motionless. As I stared with my mouth agape, I felt something grab onto my foot and I immediately recoiled. I looked down and it was the man who had crashed through the doors. He looked up at me, and with a ragged breath, he just said a single word. "Run." Just then, one of those silver things crawled into the doorway and jumped onto the man, piercing his back with its long, sharp fingers. The thing turned its metallic face upwards towards me, and I watched as it slowly began to shift and change. After a few seconds, its silver visage changed to look exactly like the man it was on top of. Just then, I looked over and saw another one of those silvery things walking towards the door. It wasn't hard to tell that it was looking directly at me. I spun on my heels and dashed down the hallway. The clattering of my footfalls across the laminated floor seemed to echo endlessly. I didn't look back the entire time. I brought a leg up and kicked the front door of the building, sending it crashing open, and I ended up doubling over outside in the parking lot. As I stopped momentarily to take a breath, I looked back for the first time and saw it approaching the open doorway. I turned and continued sprinting to my car. I jumped inside and drove away as fast as my car would allow. As I was driving, after taking a few moments to collect my thoughts, I decided to call the police and let them know that I saw an altercation at the Cypress High 20-year reunion. After a moment of silence on the other end, the dispatcher stifled a scoff and asked if I was joking. She then explained that Cypress High hadn't been in use for nearly a decade. She said that school had closed down, and the students had been moved to a larger building on the other side of town, which had since been renamed. After I insisted this wasn't a joke, she reluctantly acknowledged my distress and confirmed that officers would be sent out that way to investigate. I drove straight home after that, not wanting to stick around to see what would happen. The entire drive home, I just kept coming up with excuses for what I saw, and after a few hours of driving, I decided it would be best to just repress the whole ordeal entirely. That was until a couple of days ago, when a letter arrived in the mail. It was addressed to my wife, and it was an invitation to her 20th high school reunion. She was surprised they were even hosting such an event, especially with all that's been going on this year. She told me she was on the fence about going, telling me how nice it would be to see all her old friends again, especially after losing touch with them after all these years. A slight chill started to creep down my spine, however, as I heard her mention how odd it was that her school had somehow found her new mailing address. After all these years. I hate traveling. I like to think I'm not the only one who feels this way. While I often see friends posting on social media about their new trips across the country and around the world, I just think about all the stress that comes along with it. Having to plan and organize, not to mention all the money that goes into such endeavors. That all starts before you even leave your house for the most part. As I scrolled along the numerous websites for available flights, I couldn't help but sigh. With each new click, I could feel my eyes rolling in my head. My parents wanted to have a family reunion of sorts. It wasn't going to be a big, extended family thing, just me and my brothers returning to the proverbial nest. Once we had all turned 18, our parents basically packed up the house and moved to the retirement capital of the US, leaving each of us to fend for ourselves. My eldest brother remained in our home state, while myself and our other brother ventured further away for work. It had been nearly a decade since we had all been together, and my parents wanted to reconcile that. Parental guilt, I suppose. Upon calculating the cost of the trip, I had determined that it would be cheaper to buy a one-way ticket there than rent a car for the journey home. It wasn't cheaper by much, but truth be told, I loathed flying. Being stuck inside a metal tube with other people wasn't my idea of pleasant, so that contributed heavily to my decision. I finished purchasing my ticket and spent the weeks leading up going about my life normally. The day had arrived, and I could already tell it was going to be a rough journey when the Uber I had ordered canceled halfway to me. I cursed at my phone before ordering a new one. The second driver arrived and I loaded my bags in the back. We pulled up to the airport around an hour later. Security this time was surprisingly painless, and my plane was on time. One by one, us passengers were ushered along like sardines. I found my seat, which was nestled perfectly between a rather large man who had a gallon of sweat building on his forehead and around the collar of his suit, and a woman who seemed to own more perfume than a Macy's department store. 3.5 hours later, I had landed at my destination. I peeled myself from the faux leather seat and exited the plane. I retrieved my luggage, which thankfully made the trip in one piece, and made my way to the car rental kiosk. After finalizing everything, I loaded up the car and drove the remaining 30 minutes to my parents' house. When I had arrived, my mother greeted me with open arms. Although I despised the journey, I did enjoy getting to see my family again. My brothers and I were only in town for a few days. We could only get so much time off from our respective jobs. Eventually, my brothers and I began to depart one by one. Our parents wished us all a safe journey as they made their way to the airport and I began my drive home. While driving was tedious, I enjoyed the peace and quiet that came along with it, watching the various landscapes drift past as I made my way from state to state. The sunlight was swiftly fading on the horizon, and I could feel my eyelids starting to sag. I figured it would be safe to find a motel for the night and continue my drive in the morning. My GPS provided no aid as the road seemingly continued on for miles in one direction. Though, as I looked towards the road, I noticed a sign stating that there was a turnoff for a town up ahead. I glanced back at my phone once more and noted that there was no indication of such a deviation. Not wanting to push my luck further, I turned off the main highway and onto the side road. As the lights from the highway dissipated in my rear view, I struggled to focus on the winding road in front of me. It seemed like I had been driving for nearly an hour before I started to see a faint light in the distance. I glanced at my GPS once more, trying to figure out where exactly I was, but according to my phone, I wasn't on the main road, or any road for that matter. The road began to straighten out and I started to see vague shapes of buildings growing closer. It wasn't long until I entered the town. As I drove by the darkened houses, I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of a motel or at the very least a gas station. The longer I drove, the more I began to notice that all the houses seemed identical to each other, though with how dark it had become, I could have been mistaken. I was beginning to think driving out here was a bad idea. That was only confirmed shortly after when my vehicle began to sputter. A loud knocking sound emanated from under my car's hood and resonated throughout the interior. I slammed my hands upon the steering wheel, cursing the car, the rental place, and the trip in general. As soon as the last expletive left my mouth, the remaining life in my car extinguished. The car coasted along the road for a bit before eventually slowing down to a stop. I rubbed my tired eyes for a moment before retrieving my phone. I attempted to call a tow truck, but although I still had bars on my phone, the call never connected. I closed my phone and looked around. Numerous identical houses flanked either side of me. As much as I didn't want to, I'd have to rely on the kindness of strangers to help. I stepped out of the car and walked up to the first house nearest to me. Walking up to a stranger's house, I couldn't help but feel awkward. I stood in front of their door and took a deep breath before knocking a few times. Then I waited. I rubbed my hands together in an effort to bring some warmth back to them, and I thought I heard movement on the other side. Then nothing. I waited a few more minutes before taking the hint. I started walking away from the house and over towards another when, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted something. In the large front window of the house I was just at, there was something standing on the other side of it. A silhouette of a person standing in a dark room. I stared back at them, thinking how rude it was just to be ignored, but they probably had their reasons. I walked over towards the next house and rapped my knuckles against the wood. Minutes continuously passed by as I waited once again. Feeling the temperature starting to drop even further, I knocked once more, harder this time. There was still no answer. I started to walk back towards my car when I glanced over and saw a similar silhouette in the window again, just like the previous house. Feeling frustrated, I walked across the front lawn and up to the window. I called out to them asking if they could help me or at the very least call a tow truck or something. They didn't seem to react to me at all though. I stepped a bit closer to try and see who I was talking to, but there were no discernible features. Honestly, it looked like a cardboard cutout of a person standing there. I pointed to my car and shouted that my car had broken down. When I turned to look back to the window, however, the figure was gone. An eerie chill slithered up my spine like a snake, but I tried my best to disregard it. After realizing there was no help to be offered here, I went back to my car. I got back inside and nursed my cold extremities. When I raised my head from my hands and looked around, I could feel my heart start to thud in my chest. There were hundreds of them, all standing outside like an ocean of shadows. With a shaking hand, I reached over and locked my car's doors. With the absence of light, I still couldn't see what any of them looked like. I wasn't sure what to do. I pulled my phone out again, this time to call the police, but the call still wouldn't connect. Before I could close my phone once again, I did hear something come through the receiver. A mess of static filled my ears before a voice came through. "Join us," it said. When I heard that, I looked over and one of them was now standing inches away from my window. It raised two shadowy hands and pressed them against the glass. My heart was beating so loud by this point that I couldn't hear anything else around me. It pressed its face against the window, and in that moment, I could see what it actually looked like. Its skin was white and lifeless. Its eyes, hollow and empty. Its mouth was non-existent. The shadows around its face seemed to crackle and shift like TV static. I screamed and backed away to the passenger seat. I looked above me and there was another one looking down at me. Panic filled me as I looked around. They all seemed to be swarming over my car. My front and back windshields were covered with those identical faces. I shut my eyes tightly, praying, hoping, wishing they would all just go away. After a few minutes of nothing, I cracked open a single eye. There was a face right in front of me, looking into my eyes. A voice entered my head, and repeated the same phrase I had heard through my phone.
Join us.
When I heard that, I passed out. I don't know how long I was unconscious for, but when I finally came to, I instinctively screamed once again. I looked around and realized that those faces were no longer around my car. Upon sitting up, I made a startling realization. I was no longer in that town. I was in the middle of nowhere, on a random dirt road. I moved over to the driver's side and attempted to restart my car. With a few squeals of the ignition, my car's engine rumbled to life. I turned around and drove back the way I came. 15 minutes later, I was back on the highway and I drove straight home without stopping once. When I went to drop off the rental car, the clerk came out and inspected it along with me. He made a remark about the dirty exterior as a joke, but that just made me realize that what I had experienced wasn't some messed up nightmare. He pointed out multiple smudged handprints all over the windows. Handprints, for whatever reason, I hadn't noticed up until that point. He asked me what happened, and I just shook my head. He told me it didn't matter and thanked me for my business. I called another Uber and made it home not much later. The next time I travel, if there even is a next time, that is, I think I'll just shell out the extra cash and buy a round-trip ticket instead. I wasn't thrilled when my father initially offered me the job. Working with my family wasn't something I found appealing. Not to mention construction and demolition work never really piqued my interest either. I was more of a tech-savvy kind of guy, and working with my hands in a broad sense didn't really suit me. Not that there was anything wrong with doing that type of work, it was just how I felt personally. I had just started college and I was in desperate need of some form of income. Unfortunately, the town in which I lived had very little in the way of employment. Unless I wanted to be a cashier at a local supermarket, there wasn't very many opportunities. Much to my chagrin, I took my father up on his job offer. My dad had started his own independent construction and demolition company some years ago. With only a handful of employees, he managed to grow this small company into a somewhat lucrative business. After sitting down and speaking with him in detail about the job, I realized it actually didn't sound all that bad. He explained that he mostly needed clerical work done. He needed an extra pair of hands to process paperwork and do some inspections on potential jobs. Ultimately, he'd send me out to these locations, examine the building's exterior and interior, write down a list of things and bring it back. Then, after reviewing everything, we'd send the whole crew out to begin deconstruction. Well, about a week ago, we had received a demolition request to remove a building on the edge of town. When I first saw what the building was, I was instantly snapped back to my youth. The building was for an old Chuck E. Cheese's. For those of you unaware of what that is, it was basically a dining experience aimed towards children. They served pizza, snacks, your basic junk food items, had a truckload of various games with multiple prizes to be won. It was where a lot of kids would spend their birthday parties growing up. I should know, I was one of them. I thought back to the many years of birthday parties I had attended when I was younger. How my friends and I would run around gorging ourselves on slice after slice of pizza, while we mindlessly dropped tokens into the plethora of games, hoping to accrue just enough tickets to win the top prizes on the walls. The building itself was located quite a distance from the center of town. It was constructed in a small strip mall that was surrounded by trees and creeks. As I grew older, I rarely traveled that far out of town for anything. On the small random occasion, I'd see that one store after another would be closed and looking for new leases. It wasn't long until the pizza chain was the last one remaining. I'm not entirely sure the logistics behind it, but I think they were cutting funding to some of the stores and this one wasn't pulling enough business to endure. After my initial wave of nostalgia passed, I felt almost melancholic over the request. A piece of my childhood was ultimately going to be destroyed, and I was going to have a hand in it. My father, not being one to pass up on a work-related opportunity, was quick in dispatching me to the building. My tasks involved me surveying the nearby area for can or dumpster placements, examining the exterior for what type of equipment would be best suited, which I always suggested our largest excavator anyway, as well as inspecting the interior for any potential problems lying in wait. Most of the time, it was just squatters. You don't want to start tearing into a building and potentially injure or kill someone. I figured it wouldn't take too long to inspect the site, so I continuously pushed it off until the absolute last second. It was around 6 p.m. when I finished up a stack of paperwork and hopped in my car. The drive out to the building was a somewhat long one. Between the distance and traffic, I didn't arrive until well after 7. Luckily, since it was summer, the sun was still holding steady overhead. I pulled into the parking lot and noticed the unkempt lot itself. It was full of overgrowth from the surrounding nature, with weeds creeping up through various cracks in the cement. I parked in front of the building and stepped outside. Looking up at the worn sign, it was reaffirmed in my mind that this place, which probably filled children with fond memories, was now dead. I walked around the exterior, marking a few things on my clipboard as I went. I stepped around the left side of the building and saw a slew of mud and dirt that had probably been formed by bad weather. Everything was going well for the inspection. As I mentioned before, I only really do this as a courtesy. I stepped up to the front door, which still had a faded poster advertising games, pizza, and more, with a cartoonish Chuck E. Cheese giving a thumbs up. I pulled open the door, and an almost gasp-like sound greeted me. It was like the building had taken its first breath in a long time. It smelled like that too on the inside. The scent of stale air and mildew filled my nostrils, but I continued. I pulled out a flashlight I keep handy for jobs like this and ventured inside. For the most part, the whole interior had been gutted. Anything worth of value had long since been removed. All of the game cabinets, prize racks, and kitchen equipment had all been taken. All that was left was a faded carpet and a few decorations here and there. I scanned around with my flashlight, making notes as I went. It was clearly shaping up to be your average building demolition job. As I was walking into the main dining area, I heard a noise. It sounded like something small and metallic, clanged softly off the ground. I turned to face the direction of the sound, only to be greeted by a large wall of cloth. I was facing the main stage, where the animatronic musicians would come out and perform intermittently. I called out, asking if anyone was there. I thought perhaps a squatter had made this building his temporary residence. I identified myself loudly and clearly, that I was with a construction company and that this building was scheduled for demolition. I figured even a squatter probably wouldn't want to be in a demoed building, much less have the authorities contacted to have them removed. There was no response. I sighed. I made my way around the waist-high stage to the stairs and ascended them. I grabbed a hold of the large curtain and ventured backstage. I was surprised to find this stage was much larger than what I had remembered. I recalled just a few inches of clearance between the band and the edge of the stage. However, this one seemed to push inward for a few feet. The moment I crossed into this area, I noticed a distinct drop in temperature. The warmth from the summer heat outside had been nearly extinguished. I rubbed my arms briefly as I stepped further inward. After taking a few steps, I immediately collided with something hard. I stumbled back a few steps, rubbing my face. Wondering what I had hit, I shined my light ahead of me. Two lifeless glass eyes reflected back at me. Startled, I took a few more steps back. A moment passed before I realized that it was one of the animatronic band members. The dog, to be specific. Their names had all been lost on me. It sat in place, staring at me with a blank expression, gripping a guitar in its hands. I turned and shined my light, and spotted all of the other band members as well. The drummer, the keyboardist, and the hen were all aligned in a neat row. I thought it was odd that Chuck E. Cheese himself wasn't a part of the ensemble. I called out again, asking if anyone was staying on the stage, and that they should probably vacate the premises. But again, I received no response. Then, I heard that same metallic chime. But this time it happened behind me, back out onto the open dining room floor. I peeled the curtain back and saw the silhouette of a large figure standing dead center in the empty room. The whole room was dark, but I could tell right away that something was standing there. I aimed my light at it and saw that it was the Chuck E. Cheese animatronic. It was as if it had been standing there this whole time, but clearly it hadn't, or else I would have walked past it upon entering the room. I climbed down off stage and jotted down another note onto my clipboard. When I looked back up, Chuck E. Cheese had moved. He was slightly closer to me and offset by a few inches. I jumped back and asked if anyone was there. I told them that I would be notifying the authorities for trespassers, and that they should leave immediately. It was a bluff, but I didn't know what else to do. I rationalized that the environment and atmosphere had been getting to me, and that I should just leave with the notes I had. I took a deep breath and walked past the oversized mouse. As soon as I got within arm's reach, however, its large hand shot out from its side, grabbing a hold of my arm. I shrieked and tried to pull away, but its grip felt like a vice around my wrist. With a series of clicks and motors whirring, its head began to turn towards me. Its glass eyes looked at me, and unlike its bandmates on stage, these didn't appear lifeless. His mouth began to open, and a guttural grinding noise bellowed out. I yanked and tugged on my arm. I even resorted to kicking the robot's side. The pressure on my wrist was immense, but I kept trying to free it. I managed to wedge my hand under its fingers and pry it off of me. The second I was freed, I sprinted out of the building and jumped into my car. I drove home as quickly and as safely as possible. During the entire drive, I kept checking over my shoulder to make sure it wasn't following me. After what I had just witnessed, I wasn't leaving anything to chance. When I arrived home, I set my clipboard in my dad's office and immediately went to bed. I lied awake for hours trying desperately to understand what I had just witnessed, but I couldn't. Eventually, fatigue took me and I drifted off. I was awoken by my father asking me to get ready for work. He wanted me to accompany him to the site of the demolition. I almost declined, but I couldn't think of a good excuse on the spot. We drove to the site with the rest of the crew and did another final inspection of the place. It was much different with a large group of people this time around. The air wasn't so heavy, and I didn't feel so unnerved. My dad cracked jokes and reminisced about the good old days. He turned to me and noticed I wasn't reacting to any of his jokes. He asked me if I was all right. But I couldn't shake my attention from the empty stage in front of me. As the demolition was getting underway, I stepped outside to get some fresh air. As I leaned up against the wall, trying desperately to catch my breath, I glanced down at the dirt and mud along the side of the building. In the mud, I saw multiple sets of large, unnatural footprints, all heading off into the woods nearby. Wyatt was on duty that first week when the cinema closed due to the quarantine we're all dealing with right now. For better or for worse, he didn't want to go back for the second week. I guess being paid minimum wage to literally sit around all day doing nothing was worse than sitting around all day serving customers. It makes sense in a way. There's no distractions, so the clock moves slower and slower every minute. Jamie and Patricia alternated on the second week. The managers took care of week 3, but I guess it was beneath them because I was assigned to week 4 by myself. I guess I should be thankful. So many people are without work right now, and I was getting paid to sit around all day. You might be wondering why the hell they were staffing a closed cinema in the first place. Well, welcome to 2020. Where we pay 19-year-olds to babysit the concession stands of empty theaters on the off chance an Uber Eats order comes in because some suburbanite could not go another day without a $15 bag of popcorn and a $10 bar of candy. I'm not kidding. Load up the food app and look up any major cinema. They're out there and they're open for deliveries. Frankly, it's ridiculous. I guess the bosses felt guilty because we were given carte blanche to do whatever we wanted while waiting for orders to come in. And orders did not come in very often. I had initially written off the text Wyatt had sent our coworker chat group after his first week on duty as nothing. A simple "don't go into Theater 15" with no explanation as to why. To be honest, it didn't exactly ring any alarm bells for me. Theater 15 had the gaming setup where we rent out to party groups. I figured he had logged into his account and was trying to protect his game data. Get wrecked, Wyatt. Come to work and log out if it matters so much to you. Shortly after that, the chat room exploded in memes, and the warning was buried underneath the weight of them. My first day back on the job was freaky. My manager stopped by to show me how to work the hot dog stand, which was separate from the concessions island. She left about an hour in. I had been at the cinema after closing a few times, so it's not like I wasn't used to a mostly empty building, but it was different without my coworkers. It was so eerily quiet. You could hear a pin drop. It was dark too. Not quite emergency lighting dark, but like about half of the fluorescent lights were shut off to conserve electricity. I wasn't sure how many orders to expect, so I spent that first evening meandering the large lobby, using my employee pass to play arcade games for free, browsing the internet on my phone, and eating a metric ton of popcorn. I sat there from 3 p.m. to 10 p.m., 7 hours. And in that time, I got one order. A single order. Small popcorn, extra butter. Can you believe that? Imagine having that much disposable income. I had to clean the machines an hour or so after use, bringing the grand total of work-related tasks accomplished that night to a whopping 2. Definitely earned my paycheck. It felt like babysitting once the kids have gone to bed and the parents just leave out a bunch of junk food for you. The second night, I felt more comfortable wandering off. I kept a work tablet on me so I'd know when an order came in. Grabbed the newest releases that had arrived right before the official shutdown, and settled into Theater 1 to watch movies all night. We didn't get any orders that evening, so that was great. Someone did call asking whether we were open, which, lady, did you not hear the pre-recorded message saying that we were closed at the start of the call? She was like, "You guys are open, right?" And I was like, "You're kidding. Seriously, some people." The third night, the manager had pinned a list of tasks for me on the bulletin board. It was spring cleaning kind of stuff. Organize the uniforms by size, take inventory, deep clean the hallways. I cranked up the music on my phone and had myself a mini cleaning montage, interrupted once or twice for orders, popcorn, and honestly, I can't wrap my head around this. Nachos and cheese. Who the hell orders nachos and cheese for delivery? Especially theater nachos with the plastic cheese. I'm honestly throwing up in my mouth just thinking about it. Moving on. I don't know if the boss expected the tasks to take me a few shifts, but I finished everything in one night. Nothing new showed up on the bulletin board, so on the fourth night, I got my gaming on. Glorious Theater 15 with all the latest gaming consoles and a little library of games to play. I had it all to myself. Have you ever thought of exploring the wilds of Hyrule on the big screen? Because let me tell you, it's incredible. Everything was great at first, but after maybe half an hour, I started to get this weird creepy crawly feeling over my shoulders. That I'm feeling watched feeling, you know? I knew I was alone, so it was completely irrational, but I couldn't shake it no matter how hard I tried. I had to get up and move to the last row so I would have the wall behind me. It helped a lot, but the sensation never fully left. And then the blood moon started rising in the game, and I was like, yep, screw this. I closed the game and went for a little power walk to shake off my nerves. That damn blood moon music, man, why is it so unsettling? I went back after a bit and put on everyone's favorite red and blue plumber because there's nothing creepy about jumping around and grabbing coins. It was fine. Everything was fine. Nothing weird was happening. And yet, slowly, that feeling came back. I swept the whole room by gaze, and my stomach dropped when I saw someone sitting in the front row. I went through a roller coaster of emotions. Instant panic, rationalization, counter-rationalization, and more panic. Like, who the hell is that? Oh, it must be the manager. Wait. The manager would at least call first before showing up. Tense, I pawed around for my flashlight without taking my eyes off the figure. I aimed the light right at them. When I did, the seat was empty. I didn't see the movement of someone ducking down or anything like that. The seat was just empty. I panned the light around and nobody was there. No figure, nothing. I had to walk down there and check row by row just to make sure. Nope, no one. I convinced myself it was a shadow, maybe a bug on the projector reflecting an image. But at that point, I was done with Theater 15 for the night. I put everything away and headed back into the lobby, narrating everything I was doing in a sing-song voice because that's how I tend to cope with my nerves. Just as I arrived in the lobby, I nearly had a heart attack because the phone suddenly rang. I picked it up and, "Hi, are you guys open?" Jesus Christ. The rest of the shift was uneventful, though every now and again paranoia would hit, and I'd find myself looking over my shoulders, thinking one of my coworkers was playing a trick on me. I'd loudly announce what I was doing and where I was going and say, "I know you're there," to try and keep them from jumping out at me. But yeah, it didn't really help my nerves. I was okay on the fifth night. I had given myself a good old pep talk. No, there was nothing weird about Theater 15. Wyatt's bizarre message just got in my head. Everything was fine. There was nothing scary at all. Go play your video games. I got an early order of popcorn, so there was plenty left over for me to take into Theater 15. I chewed loudly and bravely announced to the room that I wasn't afraid and that I was going to have fun this evening. But, despite my newfound courage and conviction, I still sat in the very back row. I started exploring Hyrule again, surviving another blood moon, finished my popcorn. Everything was swell. And then, in the last row of the first set of seats, I saw it again. I saw it with my own two eyes, not from the corner of my eyes, Not for a split second before it was gone. Not something projected from the screen at seat level. It was sitting there. It was a person. I could see the outline of a male haircut. I could see a neck and shoulders. I could see some slight movement to it. I stood up quickly, knocking over my empty bag of popcorn. I pulled out my flashlight, aimed the beam right at the chair, and nothing. Not a damn thing. In the distance, I heard the phone ringing, and I hurried out of the room without checking the row so I could answer the phone. Another person asking if we were open. Bro. I massaged my temples and paced back and forth in the lobby. It was crazy. Being afraid of a theater room was crazy, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't go back in there. I left my trash in there and I moved to the other side of the building, watching a movie in Theater 1 instead, where it felt nice and safe. There's nothing more emboldening than the light of day and a good night's sleep. 3 p.m. on my 6th day at work, I showed up bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I headed to Theater 15 to clean up yesterday's mess. I had all of the lights on to see better. Yeah, we'll go with that. I climbed up the stairs all the way to the back of the theater and scooped up my trash into a dustbin. As I turned around to go back down the stairs, I swear to God, I saw someone standing halfway up the middle rows. I blinked hard, and when I opened my eyes again, they were gone. So I thought, okay buddy, you're losing your mind. Great. I so badly wanted not to be afraid of that room. You have no idea. Badly enough that I actually went in with the last of the movies I hadn't watched yet. I kept up that obnoxious habit of talking to myself. Wow, what a great movie I'm sitting here watching, in a perfectly normal theater room. No ghosts here. Nope. Everything is fine and dandy. What an idiot. I could hear my own voice trembling. I had nothing to prove to anyone. So why was I subjecting myself to this torture? If you guessed that things weren't fine and dandy, you are absolutely right. At some point while watching the movie, I felt that feeling again. My chest grew tight and I started to feel lightheaded. I could sense him in the theater. I didn't even have to look at the bottom rows. He was down there. Goosebumps formed on my arms, equal parts fear-induced and due to a sudden drop in temperature. It wasn't just my imagination. I could see my own breath lingering in the air. I shivered as I glued my eyes to the screen, trying not to look down as fear held me in my seat. I saw the figure in my peripheral vision move from one seat to the next, lining himself up as though purposely trying to put himself in direct line of sight. The lights were on. The movie was playing. I had my hand on my phone. I had every opportunity to run or call for help. But I couldn't. I held my breath as he suddenly seemed to phase into the next row up, now only 2, maybe 3 rows away from me. It was hard to tell without looking directly at him. I tried not to make a sound, as if I could make myself invisible if I was motionless and quiet enough. When I saw him phase into a row even closer, I lost it. Finally able to move, I threw my popcorn at him and ran down the stairs as fast as I could. I don't even know if my popcorn hit anything. I didn't look back. I just ran to the lobby, the only place I felt safe, and called my manager saying that someone had broken in. She told me to wait outside and said she was on her way. She and another manager arrived and we swept the entire building room by room, but no one was there. Of course no one was there. It was a goddamn ghost. Not that I'd tell them that. She actually had the nerve to ask if I could still come in for the next day. Can you believe that? I said no, and she offered to review the security footage. For some reason, that made me feel a little better. We looked at the tapes and confirmed no one had come in or out of the theater aside from me. We went through an entire week's worth of footage just to be sure. There's no video of inside the room itself. Studios don't allow it even if the cameras aren't aimed at the screens. She said she swore she'd get someone else to come in after tomorrow, but she needed me one last night. She couldn't get anyone else on such short notice, blah blah blah. I figured, all right, as long as I don't go into that room, I should be fine. On the last night, I was a nervous wreck. Every shadow made me flinch. Every stupid arcade game coming to life made my heart stutter. Every pop of the popcorn made me think I was going to die. I didn't go into a single theater that night. Not number 15, not any of them. I was like a tiger in a cage, pacing around, watching and waiting. I didn't get a single order that night. I felt like I was wasting my time. The hours were so long. Then, at around 8 p.m., the phone rang. I wanted to scream at this idiot who couldn't seem to get the message that we're in a quarantine and the cinema is closed. "Yes, hello, how may I help you?" I said through gritted teeth. Then I heard breathing on the other end. Slow and shallow. It lasted for a few long, uncomfortable seconds before the voice spoke in the low rasp of an older man.
"What's playing in Theater 15?
I know the voice came from the phone. I had the receiver up against my ear after all. But I swear on my life that I also heard the voice coming from directly behind me. I left the cinema then and there. Screw my shift. Screw my replacement. I left the machine with popcorn still in it. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I just walked out. Corporate sent out an email today. Due to trouble staffing, our one particular cinema is going to shut down from now until the end of the quarantine.